The late evening air carried the soft melodies of classical piano across the rooftop garden. The Manhattan skyline twinkled against the dark sky, providing a perfect backdrop for the elite gathering 30 floors above the busy streets. 28-year-old Julian Reed's fingers danced across the ivory keys of the grand piano, his eyes half closed as he played pieces that the wealthy guests barely noticed over their champagne glasses and business talk. Julian had been playing for nearly 3 hours straight. His back ached and his fingers were growing tired, but he didn't dare take a break yet. This gig paid triple his usual rate, and he desperately needed the money. His landlord had made it clear that another late rent payment would mean eviction from his tiny Brooklyn apartment. "Water, sir?" A server stopped beside the piano, offering Julian a glass. "Thanks," Julian whispered between notes, taking a quick sip before returning to Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece requested by the host's assistant. The server leaned closer. "The Ice Queen is watching you." Julian's eyes flicked up briefly, catching sight of a woman standing apart from the crowd. Even without the server's comment, he would have noticed her. While other guests clustered in conversation, she stood alone near the edge of the rooftop, a glass of red wine in hand, her attention seemingly fixed on him. Victoria Langley, tech genius, self-made millionaire by 25, and notoriously difficult employer according to the staffing agency that had hired Julian for the night. Her company had revolutionized artificial intelligence in medical diagnostics, making her one of the youngest billionaires in the country. The gossip magazines loved her almost as much as they feared her sharp tongue and icy demeanor. Julian finished the piece with a gentle flourish and checked his watch. Finally, time for his 15-minute break. He stood stretching his cramped fingers and rolling his shoulders. The guests continued their conversations, his music merely background noise to their networking. Instead of heading to the staff area, Julian wandered to a quieter corner of the rooftop where a smaller upright piano sat unused. This one was older, with a warmer tone that reminded him of the piano his grandmother had taught him on as a child. Away from the watchful eyes of the event coordinator, he sat down and began playing something different, not the classical pieces or jazz standards he'd been hired to perform, but something of his own. The melody started simple, almost hesitant, like someone testing cold water with their toes. Then it deepened, growing more complex as his fingers remembered the patterns he'd been working on in his apartment during late nights. It was a piece he'd composed during the worst period of his life, when music had been the only thing keeping him afloat, lost in the music. Julian didn't notice the silence that gradually fell over the nearby guests, nor did he see Victoria Langley approach until she was standing beside the piano. "That's not on the approved playlist," she said. Julian's fingers stumbled to a stop. He stood quickly, nearly knocking over the piano bench. "I'm sorry, Ms. Langley. I was just taking my break and—" "What's it called?" Her voice wasn't angry, merely curious. Julian hesitated. "It doesn't have a name yet. It's something I've been working on." Victoria studied him with intense blue eyes that seemed to catalog his every feature, from his slightly too long dark hair to his rented tuxedo that didn't quite fit right at the shoulders. "You wrote it?" She seemed genuinely surprised, as though she'd assumed he was simply a human jukebox, capable only of playing other people's creations. "Yes, I compose when I can find the time." Julian shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. Victoria took a sip of her wine, then placed the glass on top of the piano. The nearby guests were watching now, some pretending not to, others openly staring. Julian had worked enough high society events to recognize the collective tension. The host was engaging with the help, and no one knew quite what to expect. "Play something else," she commanded. "Something of yours that's finished." Julian glanced toward the main piano, where he was supposed to return in approximately 8 minutes. "Don't worry about that," Victoria said, reading his concern. "This is my party. Play something that matters to you." Julian sat back down, his heart racing. This could either be his big break or the fastest way to get fired. He took a deep breath and began playing another original piece, one he had completed months ago, a composition that flowed between hope and sorrow like two streams meeting and parting. The rooftop fell completely silent except for the music and the distant sound of city traffic below. Even the servers paused in their duties, watching the unexpected scene unfold. Julian forgot about his audience, forgot about Victoria Langley standing beside him, forgot about everything except the story his hands were telling through the keys. When the final notes faded away, he looked up to find Victoria's expression had changed. The coolness remained, but something else had joined it. A hint of recognition, perhaps, or understanding. "You're wasted here," she said quietly, though in the silence, everyone nearby heard her words. Playing background music that no one really listens to. Julian didn't know how to respond. It was the same thing his old music professor had told him before life had forced him to abandon his scholarship and take care of his family. Victoria turned suddenly to address the watching crowd. "Don't you all have something better to do than eavesdrop?" Her tone was light but carried enough edge that people immediately resumed their conversations, moving away to give the illusion of privacy. She turned back to Julian. "Why are you playing at parties instead of concerts?" The question felt invasive, but something in her expression suggested genuine interest rather than judgment. "Life doesn't always go as planned," Julian answered simply. "Bills need paying." Victoria nodded as though he'd confirmed something she'd already guessed. She reached for her wineglass and took another slow sip, her eyes never leaving his face. "I have a proposition for you," she said finally. "A challenge, if you will." Julian had heard stories about Victoria Langley's challenges. The staffing agency had specifically warned him that she sometimes tested people's skills in unexpected ways, often with high stakes attached. "What kind of challenge?" he asked cautiously. A slight smile curved her lips. "Play that piano." She nodded toward the grand piano at the center of the rooftop. "And I'll go out with you." Julian blinked, certain he'd misheard. "I'm sorry." Victoria leaned closer, her voice dropping lower. "Play something that moves me to tears and I'll go on a date with you. Simple as that." Despite her attempt at privacy, several nearby guests had overheard. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and Julian noticed phones being discreetly raised to capture whatever might happen next. "Ms. Langley, I don't think—" "Are you not interested?" Her eyebrow arched, the challenge in her voice unmistakable. "It's not that. She's toying with you," a female guest in a sleek black dress murmured as she passed. "She does this. Don't fall for it." Victoria's smile only widened at the comment. "Well, are you brave enough to try where others have failed?" Julian understood the dynamics at play. To Victoria and her guests, this was entertainment, watching the hired help squirm under an impossible challenge. The stories about her were apparently true, yet something in her eyes when she'd listened to his music had seemed genuine. "What would this piece need to make you cry?" Julian asked, deciding to engage rather than retreat. The crowd's whispers grew louder. No one had expected him to accept the challenge. Victoria seemed momentarily taken aback by his question. She recovered quickly. "If I told you that, it wouldn't be much of a test, would it?" "Figure it out. You have the talent, clearly. The question is whether you have the insight." Julian stood, straightening his ill-fitting jacket. "And if I succeed? Then you'll have accomplished something no one in this room believes possible," Victoria replied. "Including me." Their conversation was interrupted by the event coordinator rushing over, her face tight with stress. "Mr. Reed, your break ended 3 minutes ago." "The main piano," Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "He's following my instructions, Diane. That takes priority over your schedule." Julian felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him as he walked back to the grand piano. The guests made no pretense of disinterest now. They openly watched, some smirking, others curious about how this unexpected drama would unfold. As Julian took his seat at the main piano, he heard snippets of conversation. "Poor guy doesn't know what he's in for. She's never been moved to tears by anything. 10,000 says he fails miserably." He flexed his fingers over the keys, suddenly aware that he was no longer background music. For this moment, he was the main event. The question was whether Victoria's challenge was sincere, or merely a rich woman's idea of entertainment at someone else's expense. Julian began to play, not one of his existing pieces but something new, something that formed beneath his fingers as naturally as breathing. If she wanted emotion, he would give her truth instead of performance. The notes came from memories of his own tears, his own laughter, his own life with all its unexpected turns. Victoria remained standing where she was, wineglass in hand, her face unreadable as the music filled the rooftop garden. The city lights twinkled behind her, oblivious to the drama unfolding among the elites and the piano player who had just stepped into a game he didn't fully understand. What no one knew, Not the gossiping guests, not the concerned staff, not even Julian himself, was that Victoria Langley hadn't issued this challenge on a whim. She had her reasons, buried beneath layers of carefully constructed indifference. Reasons that had made her stop and listen when the hired pianist played something real in a world of pretense. And as Julian played, her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the stem of her wine glass, the only visible sign that perhaps, just perhaps, his music was reaching somewhere she had long kept sealed away from the world. Julian's fingers slowed on the keys as the last notes of his improvised piece faded into the night air. The rooftop had fallen completely silent. Even the city below seemed to be holding its breath. He looked up to find Victoria still watching him, her expression unreadable. "Well?" someone from the crowd finally asked, breaking the tension. Victoria took a slow sip of her wine. "Interesting attempt," she said, her voice giving nothing away. "But I don't see any tears." She checked her watch. "The night is young. Perhaps you'll try again later." With that, she turned and walked away, rejoining a group of executives who immediately leaned in to hear what she might say about the unexpected entertainment. Julian released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He hadn't expected to succeed on his first try, wasn't even sure what success would look like, but the dismissal still stung. The event coordinator hurried over, looking both relieved and concerned. "That was unconventional," she said quietly. "Please stick to the approved playlist for the remainder of the evening." Julian nodded and began playing a gentle Chopin nocturne, allowing himself to fade back into the background where the wealthy guests preferred their musicians to stay. Yet as he played, his mind was already working on what he might try next. There had been a moment, brief but unmistakable, when something in his music had reached Victoria. He'd seen it in the slight tightening of her fingers around her glass, the almost imperceptible change in her breathing. The rest of the evening passed without incident. Victoria didn't approach the piano again, though Julian occasionally felt her eyes on him from across the rooftop. By the time the last guest departed shortly after midnight, his fingers were stiff and his back ached from hours of playing. "Not bad for your first Langley event," said a tall man in kitchen whites as Julian packed up his sheet music. The man was wiping down nearby tables, his movements efficient despite the late hour. "Thanks," Julian replied, stretching his cramped shoulders. "Do you work these often?" "Going on 3 years now." The man extended his hand. "I'm Theo, head of catering." "Julian." They shook hands. 3 years? You must know the infamous Ms. Langley pretty well then." Theo glanced around as if checking who might be listening, though the rooftop was nearly empty now. "Well enough to warn you, don't take her challenge seriously. She's done this before." Julian paused in his packing. "What do you mean?" "The challenges. They're like entertainment for her. Last summer she told a sommelier she'd invest in his vineyard dream if he could identify a wine while blindfolded. Poor guy studied for weeks, came back, and she changed the terms, said it was too easy and added impossible conditions. Did he ever succeed? No one does, Theo said simply. That's the point. It's just a game to her. He finished wiping down the last table. No offense, but you're just this week's distraction. Next week it'll be someone else. Julian shouldered his bag, considering Theo's words. Has anyone ever come close to winning one of her challenges? Theo thought for a moment. There was a chef about a year ago. He was supposed to create a dish that would remind her of childhood. Spent days researching her background. Created something really special. I thought maybe. He shook his head. She took one bite, said it was derivative, and moved on. Sounds like a real piece of work, Julian muttered. The thing is, Theo added, lowering his voice further, she wasn't always like this. My cousin worked for her family years ago before she made her fortune. Said she was different then, more human. What changed her? Theo shrugged. Life probably, success, money, the usual suspects. He checked his watch. I should finish up. Just wanted to give you a friendly warning. Don't get your hopes up about that challenge. It's not about the music. Julian thanked him for the advice and headed for the service elevator. As the doors were closing, a hand shot out to stop them. Victoria's assistant, a razor-thin woman with immaculate clothes and perpetually worried eyes, stepped in. Mr. Reed, she said, her tone businesslike. Ms. Langley asked me to give you this. She handed him an envelope. Julian opened it to find a check for twice the amount he'd been promised for the evening's work, along with a business card with a phone number handwritten on the back. "What's this for?" he asked, confused. "The extra payment is for the private performance. The number is in case you decide to continue the challenge." The assistant's expression softened slightly. For what it's worth, I've never seen her give anyone a second chance before. Before Julian could ask more questions, they reached the ground floor, and the assistant hurried away toward a waiting luxury car. The next morning, Julian woke late in his tiny apartment. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, illuminating the cramped space. A mattress on the floor, a keyboard on a folding table, and stacks of sheet music and composition notebooks everywhere. The walls were thin enough that he could hear his neighbor's television and the arguments of the couple upstairs. He made coffee and sat at his keyboard, the events of the previous night replaying in his mind. Common sense told him to take Theo's advice and forget about Victoria Langley's challenge. The extra money she'd paid him would cover his rent for the month, with enough left over to repair his second-hand laptop. He should focus on finding his next gig, not chasing impossible challenges from bored billionaires. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there had been something real in that moment when she'd first heard him play his own music. Something beyond the games and the performance she put on for her guests. Julian pulled out his phone and stared at the business card. After several minutes of internal debate, he sent a text to the number. "This is Julian Reed. I'd like to accept your challenge." He didn't expect an immediate response, so he was surprised when his phone buzzed less than a minute later. 1 p.m. Angelo's Cafe on West 47th. Come alone. At precisely 1 p.m., Julian pushed open the door to Angelo's, a small, unassuming coffee shop tucked between larger buildings. The place was half empty, with most patrons focused on laptops or books. Victoria sat in a corner booth, wearing sunglasses and casual clothes that probably cost more than Julian's monthly rent. Without her evening gown and the trappings of her rooftop party, she looked almost ordinary, if you ignored the sleek lines of her designer jeans and the subtle gleam of her watch. "You're punctual," she said as he slid into the seat across from her. "I appreciate that. Why am I here?" Julian asked directly. Victoria removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes that looked tired despite her flawless makeup. "Because I'm curious. Most people don't accept my challenges once they learn the odds. Maybe I like impossible odds. Or maybe you're desperate." She took a sip from her coffee cup. "I looked you up this morning. Julian Reed, former prodigy, accepted to Juilliard at 17, dropped out after your first year. Now you play weddings and corporate events." She tilted her head slightly. "What happened?" The question felt like a test. "Life happened," Julian answered simply. "Why do you care?" "I don't, particularly. But if you're going to try to move me to tears with your music, you should understand what you're up against." Victoria leaned forward slightly. "I haven't cried in 8 years, 3 months, and 14 days. Not at funerals, not at births, not while watching the saddest movies or listening to the most beautiful symphonies." Julian studied her face. "That sounds exhausting." For a moment, Victoria seemed caught off guard by his response. She recovered quickly. "It's efficient. Emotions are messy and unproductive. And yet here you are challenging me to make you feel something." A server approached their table, but Victoria waved them away without looking up. "I'm not challenging you to make me feel something. I feel plenty. I'm challenging you to break through a very specific barrier. There's a difference." "Why?" Julian pressed.
"Why me? Why now?"
Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "Because you played something last night that almost—" She stopped herself. "Let's just say you showed potential. Don't let it go to your head." Julian considered pushing for more, but something in her expression warned him against it. "So what are the rules of this challenge?" "You have 2 weeks," Victoria said. "On the 28th, I'm hosting a private gathering at my penthouse. 8 guests, intimate setting. You'll play whatever piece you believe might succeed. 1 attempt, no second chances, and if I win, then I'll go on a date with you as promised. Dinner at the restaurant of your choice. And if I fail?" Victoria's lips curved in a slight smile. "Then you walk away with a generous payment for your time and the knowledge that you tried something most people wouldn't dare." Julian nodded slowly, turning the proposition over in his mind. 2 weeks to compose something that would break through 8 years of emotional walls. It was probably impossible, just as Theo had warned. "One more question," Julian said. "Why do you do this? These challenges that no one can win, what do you get out of them?" For the briefest moment, something vulnerable flickered across Victoria's face. Then it was gone, replaced by her usual cool composure. Entertainment, she said simply. Life can be tediously predictable when you have enough money to buy anything. Watching people strive for the impossible adds a little spice. She stood, leaving cash on the table for her untouched second coffee. My assistant will contact you with the details for the 28th. As she walked away, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been lying, not just to him, but to herself. There was something more to these challenges, something personal that she kept carefully hidden. That night, Julian sat at his keyboard until dawn, filling pages with notes and crossing them out just as quickly. If he was going to accept this impossible challenge, he needed to understand what had locked Victoria's tears away 8 years, 3 months and 14 days ago, and for that, he would need help. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of coffee, sleepless nights, and endless composition. Julian had canceled his other gigs to focus entirely on Victoria's challenge, a decision his bank account would soon regret if he failed. His tiny apartment became a cave of crumpled papers and half-empty takeout containers. The keyboard rarely fell silent, even in the early morning hours when his neighbors pounded on the walls in protest. On day 5, he realized he was approaching the challenge all wrong. Creating music to manipulate emotions was what film composers did every day, using minor chords for sadness, swelling strings for hope, staccato rhythms for tension. But Victoria would see through such obvious techniques. She wasn't asking for a performance. She was asking for truth. Julian spent the next 3 days researching Victoria Langley. The internet offered the usual public information: her rise as a tech prodigy, the medical diagnostics company she'd built from scratch, her reputation as a ruthless businesswoman. But nothing explained what might have happened 8 years ago to lock her tears away. On day 9, desperate for a breakthrough, Julian reached out to the only person who might help. He texted Victoria's assistant, "To complete the challenge properly, I need to understand what happened 8 years, 3 months, and 14 days ago." The response came hours later. "That's not part of the challenge." "Good luck, Mr. Reed." Julian stared at his phone, then typed again, "I'm not trying to cheat. I just want to understand." This time the reply took even longer. Just when Julian had given up hope, his phone buzzed around midnight. "The West Haven Cemetery. Row 17, plot 23. Don't tell her I told you." The next morning, Julian found himself standing in front of a simple granite headstone. The marker read, "Robert Langley, 1960-2017. Beloved father, brilliant mind, gentle soul." The dates matched Victoria's timeline perfectly. 8 years, 3 months, and 14 days since she'd last cried. A groundskeeper was raking nearby leaves. Julian approached him, introducing himself as a friend of the family. "The Langley plot." The older man nodded. "Sad story, that one. Could you tell me about it?" Julian asked quietly. The groundskeeper leaned on his rake. "Not much to tell that isn't in the papers. Big shot research doctor working on some rare disease. Ended up dying from the very thing he was trying to cure." He shook his head. "Ironic, isn't it?" "His daughter," Julian prompted. "Oh, she was here every Sunday for the first year. Always alone, never saw her shed a tear. Brought fresh flowers, sat for exactly 30 minutes, then left. Haven't seen her in years now, though someone still delivers flowers on his birthday." Julian thanked the man and lingered at the grave, piecing together what he'd learned. Victoria's father had died from a rare disease he'd been researching. She'd visited regularly but never cried. Now she never came at all, though she remembered his birthday. It wasn't much, but it was something real, something beyond the carefully crafted public image of the ice-cold tech millionaire. On his way home, Julian made one more stop. The university library's medical archives required some sweet-talking to access, but eventually a sympathetic librarian helped him find what he needed. Articles by Dr. Robert Langley on a rare genetic disorder called Halloway-Mercer syndrome. Julian wasn't surprised to discover that Victoria's company now funded the largest research initiative for finding a cure. Back at his apartment, Julian sat at his keyboard, but didn't play. Instead, he closed his eyes and thought about his own losses. His mother's death when he was a child, his brother's battle with addiction, the scholarship he'd given up to care for his family. He thought about grief that couldn't be expressed, pain that had to be locked away to survive. When his fingers finally touched the keys, the music that emerged wasn't designed to manipulate emotions. It was a conversation between loss and hope, between what breaks us and what helps us continue. Julian played until his neighbors complained again, then switched to composing with headphones until dawn broke. The day of the challenge arrived too quickly. Julian had barely slept, spending the previous night making final adjustments to his composition. As instructed, he arrived at Victoria's penthouse at precisely 7 p.m., carrying nothing but sheet music and dark circles under his eyes. Victoria's assistant met him in the lobby and escorted him to a private elevator. "She's in a mood tonight," she whispered as the doors closed. The board meeting ran long and one of the guests canceled last minute. Julian nodded, too focused on what lay ahead to make small talk. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, an expansive space of glass and minimalist furniture, with panoramic views of the city. A baby grand piano stood near the windows, its polished surface reflecting the sunset. 7 people milled about with drinks in hand, all dressed expensively but casually. Julian recognized a few faces from business magazines and tech conferences. Victoria was nowhere to be seen. "You can warm up if you'd like," the assistant told him, gesturing to the piano. "She'll be out shortly." Julian sat at the bench testing the keys. The piano was perfectly tuned, its action responsive in a way his keyboard at home could never match. He played a few scales to feel the instrument, aware of curious glances from Victoria's guests. "That's not why we're here," a voice called out. Victoria stood in a doorway wearing a simple black dress that looked more expensive than Julian's monthly rent. "We were promised something special, weren't we, Mr. Reed?" The guests moved to arrange themselves on the couches and chairs facing the piano. Victoria remained standing, leaning against a wall with a glass of amber liquid in her hand. "Before you begin," she said, "I should inform everyone of the stakes. 2 weeks ago, I challenged Mr. Reed to play something that would move me to tears. If he succeeds, I've agreed to go on a date with him." This drew chuckles from the guests. "If he fail," she shrugged. "Well then, we've all enjoyed some live music with our drinks." Julian met her eyes across the room. "May I say something first?" Victoria raised an eyebrow but nodded. "I didn't come here to win a date," Julian said quietly. "I came because music is meant to be shared, especially the pieces that come from our deepest places." He turned to the keyboard. "This piece is called What We Carry." He began to play softly at first, a simple melody in a minor that spoke of questions without answers. The notes hung in the air like autumn leaves drifting down, hesitant and solitary. Then came a second theme in the left hand, stronger and more insistent, pushing against the melancholy of the first. As the piece progressed, Julian forgot about the challenge, forgot about the wealthy audience, forgot about everything except the conversation happening between his hands. The melody fragmented and reformed, building toward something that wasn't quite resolution but wasn't despair either. Halfway through, he glanced up and saw Victoria had moved closer, her drink forgotten on a side table. Her face remained composed, but her eyes were fixed on his hands with an intensity that told him she was hearing the questions beneath the notes. When Julian reached the heart of the composition, he closed his eyes, letting muscle memory guide him through the most personal passage, the one he'd written thinking about his brother's recovery and his father's pride, about loss that wasn't permanent but still left scars. This was the section where he'd hidden a faint echo of a lullaby. His research told him Victoria's father might have sung to her as a child, based on his Hungarian heritage. The melody hung for a moment on a suspended chord, aching for resolution, before falling into a gentle major key that felt like sunrise after a long night. Julian opened his eyes and saw Victoria had moved again, standing now at the corner of the piano. Her expression remained neutral, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the instrument. As Julian brought the piece toward its conclusion, he wasn't playing for the challenge anymore. He was playing for the girl who had lost her father, the woman who had locked away her grief for 8 years, 3 months, and 14 days. The final notes weren't triumphant but weren't defeated either. They were an acknowledgement that some pain never fully leaves us, but we carry it differently as time passes. The last note faded into silence. For several seconds, no one in the room moved or spoke. Then one of the guests cleared his throat. "That was quite out." Victoria's voice was barely audible. The guest blinked. I'm sorry? Everyone out. Victoria still hadn't moved from her position at the piano, her eyes fixed on some middle distance. Now please. The guests exchanged confused glances but began gathering their things. Victoria's assistant hurried to usher them toward the elevator, murmuring apologies about an unexpected situation. Julian remained seated, unsure if the command included him. Victoria hadn't looked at him once since he'd finished playing. When the last guest had been escorted out, Victoria finally moved. Without a word, she walked to the wall of windows and stared out at the city lights. Her back was to Julian, her shoulders rigid. Should I go too? Julian asked softly. Victoria didn't turn around. Did you go to his grave? Julian hesitated, then decided on honesty.
Yes. And did you research his work?
His disease? Yes. Victoria nodded once, her silhouette sharp against the night sky beyond the glass. That lullaby. He used to sing it when I couldn't sleep. I'm sorry if that was, don't. Victoria's voice caught slightly. Just don't speak. Not yet. Julian fell silent, watching her reflection in the window. Her face remained composed, but he saw her reach up once to touch her cheek. After what felt like minutes, Victoria turned. Her eyes were dry, but something had changed in them. Some wall had shifted, if not fallen. You didn't win, she said quietly. No tears. Not quite. Julian nodded, understanding that something more important than the challenge had happened here. But I think, Victoria added, her voice steadier now, we should talk about your music, and perhaps other things as well. It wasn't a date, Julian realized. It was something far more genuine, an invitation to a real conversation after years of silence. Victoria walked to a sleek cabinet along the wall and removed 2 crystal glasses. Drink? She asked, her voice almost normal again. Julian nodded, suddenly aware of how dry his throat felt after playing. She poured amber liquid into both glasses and handed him one, then sat not on the couch where her guests had been, but on the piano bench beside him. The proximity was unexpected, close enough that he could smell her expensive perfume, something with notes of vanilla and sandalwood. How did you know? She asked after taking a sip. About your father? Julian stared into his glass. Your assistant mentioned the date, 8 years, 3 months, 14 days. I figured it had to be significant. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Diane told you? Not directly. Just where to look. Julian hesitated. I hope she won't get in trouble. Victoria made a dismissive gesture. Diane has been with me for 10 years. She's allowed certain indiscretions. She took another slow sip. But that doesn't explain the lullaby. I did some research on Hungarian folk songs after I learned your father's background. Julian set his glass down on the piano. I found several traditional lullabies and incorporated elements of one that seemed right somehow. It was. Victoria's fingers traced the rim of her glass. He sang it every night until I was 12 and declared myself too old for lullabies. A faint smile touched her lips. Then he hummed it instead, pretending he was just thinking to himself when he passed my room. They sat in silence for a moment, the memory hanging between them. I lost my mother when I was 11, Julian said quietly. Cancer. For years I couldn't listen to the songs she used to sing while cooking. Now they're the only way I feel close to her. Victoria studied his face. Is that what this was about? Finding common ground in our losses? No, Julian answered honestly. It was about understanding what might have locked your tears away. Music is most powerful when it speaks to specific emotions. Not general ones. Very calculated, Victoria said, a hint of her usual coolness returning. Not calculated, truthful. Julian turned slightly to face her. I could have written something manipulative, swelling crescendos, heartbreaking minor chords, all the tricks composers use to force emotions. But you would have seen right through it. So instead you used my father's lullaby. Some might call that manipulation of a higher order. Julian shook his head. I used it because it mattered to you. And because, he paused, choosing his words carefully, because I understood something about you after visiting his grave. Victoria went still. What was that? That you're still keeping your promise to him. Her eyes widened slightly. What promise? To finish what he started. Julian gestured toward the city below. Your company funds the largest research initiative for Halloway-Mercer syndrome, the disease that took him. Victoria stood abruptly, walking back to the window. For a moment, Julian thought he'd gone too far, crossed some invisible boundary. He made me promise not to cry at his funeral, she said finally, her back to Julian. Said he'd spent his life fighting to save others, and he didn't want his own daughter drowning in grief when she could be continuing his work. Her reflection in the glass showed a tight smile. I kept both promises, no tears, and I've poured millions into research for a cure. Julian remained silent, sensing she wasn't finished. The night he died, I played piano for him. Victoria's voice had dropped so low Julian had to strain to hear it. I was adequate, never gifted like you. But he loved to hear me play. I was in the middle of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata when he took his last breath. She turned around, her composure fully restored. I haven't touched a piano since, until tonight. Julian watched as Victoria crossed the room again, this time stopping at a small side table. She picked up a framed photograph he hadn't noticed before. A middle-aged man with kind eyes and Victoria's same determined chin, his arm around a younger version of herself. This was taken the summer before his diagnosis, she said, looking at the photo rather than at Julian. We were in Budapest visiting his childhood home. She set the frame down carefully. He told me once that Hungary has the highest per capita rate of musical geniuses in the world. He wanted me to be one of them. But you found another path. Victoria nodded. Medicine. Science. Things that save lives rather than just filling them with beauty. There was no bitterness in her voice, just matter-of-fact certainty. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Julian said gently. Perhaps not. Victoria finally looked at him directly. Your brother, the one in recovery, did music help him? Julian blinked, surprised by the question. How did you? Your composition. There was a section that spoke of addiction and healing. It wasn't about you, but someone close to you. Now it was Julian's turn to be taken aback by her perceptiveness. Yes. My brother Ryan struggled with opioids for years after a sports injury. Music became our way of communicating when words failed. He smiled faintly. He's 2 years clean now, working as a counselor. Victoria nodded as if confirming something to herself. She walked to the piano and ran her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. I should go, Julian said, sensing the evening had reached a natural conclusion. Do you still want your date? Victoria asked suddenly. Julian stood, caught off guard by the question. I meant what I said before. This wasn't about winning a date. That's not what I asked. Victoria's tone was challenging now, more like the woman who had issued the impossible task 2 weeks ago. Julian considered his answer carefully. I'd rather have a conversation with the real Victoria Langley than a date with the ice queen everyone thinks they know. Something flashed in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. Bold words from someone who plays piano at parties for a living. I don't just play at parties, Julian replied, a hint of defiance in his voice. I compose, I teach. I'm working on a piece for a documentary about addiction recovery. He held her gaze. We all have depths others don't see, Victoria. She was quiet for a long moment, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a business card. My private number, she said, holding it out to him. Not the one Diane gave you. No one has this except my father's old research partner. Julian took the card, confused by this turn in the conversation. Why are you giving me this? Because I have a proposal, Victoria said. Not a challenge this time. A genuine offer. Julian waited, sensing whatever she was about to say was difficult for her. The foundation I established in my father's name hosts an annual benefit gala next month. The theme is Art and Science Partners in Healing. Victoria spoke with careful precision. We showcase innovative medical technologies alongside artistic expressions of the healing process. Sounds impressive. It is. Victoria took a breath. I'd like to commission you to compose an original piece for the event, something that captures the relationship between artistic expression and medical healing. Julian stared at her, taken aback. You want me to write music for your foundation? For a significant fee, of course, Victoria added quickly, and with prominent credit. It would be performed by the City Symphony in the concert hall downtown. The offer was beyond anything Julian had dared hope for when he'd accepted her challenge. A commissioned piece performed by professional musicians in front of an audience of wealthy potential patrons. Why me? He asked, echoing her earlier question. There are composers with far more impressive resumes. Don't get sentimental on me now, Reed, she said. but there was warmth beneath the words. "We have a performance to deliver," Julian smiled, recognizing the deflection for what it was, not rejection, but Victoria's way of managing emotions that still felt dangerous to her. "Yes, ma'am," he replied with a mock salute. The house lights dimmed, and Julian took his seat in the front row while Victoria remained backstage. The conductor stepped out to enthusiastic applause, said a few words about the foundation's work, and then introduced Parallel Paths, a collaboration between promising young composer Julian Reed and our own Victoria Langley. From the first notes, Julian knew the symphony had captured what he and Victoria had intended. The music moved through its phases, the frantic confusion of initial diagnosis, the grim determination of treatment, the setbacks and small victories along the way. The audience sat rapt as the piece built toward the final movement, which represented the integration of loss into a life that continues. As the transition to the final movement approached, Julian found himself holding his breath. This was the moment Victoria would walk onto the stage and take her place at the grand piano. When the cue came, he watched the side of the stage. For a terrible moment, no one appeared. Then Victoria stepped into the light. Whispers rippled through the audience. Many knew her only as a businesswoman and philanthropist, not as a musician. She walked to the piano with her head high, her expression serene, and took her seat without fanfare. At the conductor's signal, she began to play. Her entrance was perfect, the simple, haunting melody that echoed her father's Hungarian lullaby, now transformed into something that spoke of both sorrow and hope. As the orchestra joined her, building around the piano's voice, Julian saw Victoria close her eyes briefly, allowing the music to flow through her. There was one transcendent moment when the full orchestra fell silent, leaving only Victoria at the piano, playing a passage that Julian had labeled in the score as Remembrance. He had written it for her father, and she played it not with the technical precision she had shown in rehearsals, but with something deeper, more raw. When the orchestra rejoined for the final swelling conclusion, Julian noticed something that the rest of the audience couldn't see from their seats, a single tear trailing down Victoria's cheek as she played. She made no move to wipe it away, continuing to play flawlessly as it fell. The piece ended not with dramatic flourish but with quiet resolution, a final chord that hung in the air, neither completely sad nor completely happy, much like life itself. For several seconds after the music stopped, the hall remained absolutely silent. Then the audience rose to their feet in a thunderous standing ovation. Victoria stood and bowed alongside the conductor and concertmaster. Her face showed no trace of the tear, but when she found Julian in the audience, she gave him the smallest of nods in acknowledgement of what had passed between them, what they had created together. At the reception afterward, Julian stood awkwardly in his rented tuxedo, accepting congratulations from people whose net worth exceeded anything he could imagine. Victoria moved through the crowd with practiced ease, thanking donors and discussing research initiatives. Later, as the crowd thinned, she appeared at his side with 2 glasses of champagne. "To Parallel Paths," she said, offering him one. Julian took it. "To new beginnings." They clinked glasses, and Victoria added quietly, "And to my father, who would have loved every note." "He heard it," Julian said with certainty. "Through you," Victoria's expression softened. "I felt him there. When I played his lullaby, I saw," Julian said gently, "the tear." Victoria touched her cheek as if she might still find it there. 8 years, 4 months, and 12 days, she said, a hint of wonder in her voice. "It appears your challenge has a delayed victory," Julian smiled. "Does this mean I finally get that date?" "No," Victoria replied, but she was almost smiling now. "It means we have more music to write. The second movement needs revision, and I have ideas for a companion piece focused on the researchers themselves." Julian laughed. Always the businesswoman moving straight to the next project. "Of course." Victoria's eyes held a warmth he had never seen before. "But perhaps we could discuss it over dinner tomorrow. Not as a date, naturally. Purely professional." "Purely professional," Julian agreed, his smile widening. "Though I should warn you, I've been known to play piano in restaurants if they have one available." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Victoria said. And this time she did smile, fully and without reservation, like someone who had remembered how, around them, the gala continued. but they stood together in a moment of shared understanding, two people who had found unexpected harmony in the spaces between their different worlds. "Don't get sentimental on me now, Reed," she said, but there was warmth beneath the words. "We have a performance to deliver," Julian smiled, recognizing the deflection for what it was, not rejection, but Victoria's way of managing emotions that still felt dangerous to her. "Yes, ma'am," he replied with a mock salute. The house lights dimmed, and Julian took his seat in the front row while Victoria remained backstage. The conductor stepped out to enthusiastic applause, said a few words about the foundation's work, and then introduced Parallel Paths, a collaboration between promising young composer Julian Reed and our own Victoria Langley. From the first notes, Julian knew the symphony had captured what he and Victoria had intended. The music moved through its phases, the frantic confusion of initial diagnosis, the grim determination of treatment, the setbacks and small victories along the way. The audience sat rapt as the piece built toward the final movement, which represented the integration of loss into a life that continues. As the transition to the final movement approached, Julian found himself holding his breath. This was the moment Victoria would walk onto the stage and take her place at the grand piano. When the cue came, he watched the side of the stage. For a terrible moment, no one appeared. Then Victoria stepped into the light. Whispers rippled through the audience. Many knew her only as a businesswoman and philanthropist, not as a musician. She walked to the piano with her head high, her expression serene, and took her seat without fanfare. At the conductor's signal, she began to play. Her entrance was perfect, the simple, haunting melody that echoed her father's Hungarian lullaby, now transformed into something that spoke of both sorrow and hope. As the orchestra joined her, building around the piano's voice, Julian saw Victoria close her eyes briefly, allowing the music to flow through her. There was one transcendent moment when the full orchestra fell silent, leaving only Victoria at the piano, playing a passage that Julian had labeled in the score as Remembrance. He had written it for her father, and she played it not with the technical precision she had shown in rehearsals, but with something deeper, more raw. When the orchestra rejoined for the final swelling conclusion, Julian noticed something that the rest of the audience couldn't see from their seats, a single tear trailing down Victoria's cheek as she played. She made no move to wipe it away, continuing to play flawlessly as it fell. The piece ended not with dramatic flourish but with quiet resolution, a final chord that hung in the air, neither completely sad nor completely happy, much like life itself. For several seconds after the music stopped, the hall remained absolutely silent. Then the audience rose to their feet in a thunderous standing ovation. Victoria stood and bowed alongside the conductor and concertmaster. Her face showed no trace of the tear, but when she found Julian in the audience, she gave him the smallest of nods in acknowledgement of what had passed between them, what they had created together. At the reception afterward, Julian stood awkwardly in his rented tuxedo, accepting congratulations from people whose net worth exceeded anything he could imagine. Victoria moved through the crowd with practiced ease, thanking donors and discussing research initiatives. Later, as the crowd thinned, she appeared at his side with 2 glasses of champagne. "To Parallel Paths," she said, offering him one. Julian took it. "To new beginnings." They clinked glasses, and Victoria added quietly, "And to my father, who would have loved every note." "He heard it," Julian said with certainty. "Through you," Victoria's expression softened. "I felt him there. When I played his lullaby, I saw," Julian said gently. "The tear." Victoria touched her cheek as if she might still find it there. 8 years, 4 months, and 12 days, she said, a hint of wonder in her voice. "It appears your challenge has a delayed victory," Julian smiled. "Does this mean I finally get that date?" "No," Victoria replied, but she was almost smiling now. "It means we have more music to write. The second movement needs revision, and I have ideas for a companion piece focused on the researchers themselves." Julian laughed. Always the businesswoman moving straight to the next project. "Of course." Victoria's eyes held a warmth he had never seen before. "But perhaps we could discuss it over dinner tomorrow. Not as a date, naturally. Purely professional." "Purely professional," Julian agreed, his smile widening. "Though I should warn you, I've been known to play piano in restaurants if they have one available." I wouldn't expect anything less, Victoria said. And this time she did smile, fully and without reservation, like someone who had remembered how, around them, the gala continued. But they stood together in a moment of shared understanding, two people who had found unexpected harmony in the spaces between their different worlds.